I grew up in a family that where my dad definitely already had been, red, green, and black pilled back even in the 60s when he was a student radical. So he was a young immigrant to Canada from Hungary, having already been disillusioned once by, finding out the truth about the great leader Stalin that he had worshipped as a kid, and then all of a sudden Soviet tanks are rolling into Budapest at age 13 or age 12, and this is after barely surviving the Holocaust thanks to the Red Army. So now the heroes have become the enemies. Then he gets to America and thinks, okay, great, shining city on the hill, freedom, whatever. Then he learns about Vietnam. Um, and then it was Zionism, right? The salvation of the Jewish people. We're not going to be victims anymore. Redemption in our promised land. Um, but right around the 1967 war, he started reading other accounts and realized that something called the Nakba happened. And so he was way ahead of the curve in terms of anti-Zionist Jews escaping from the cult of Zionism, because some Jews never bought into it, right? By the time I was born, he was already an activist on anti-imperialist causes, speaking out for the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, other victims of U.S. dirty wars in the 80s. And then the first time I became aware of this whole issue and his, what can I say? Yeah, heterodox stance on it was the first Intifada.
Okay.
Now, this set up an interesting conflict within me, or at least an interesting tension, because on the one hand, I had my father going on national radio in Canada, live from the West Bank, where he was there on a medical delegation, and he was weeping on the air, describing how he had been weeping every day for a week there, seeing Palestinian kids with so-called rubber bullets, American-made,
Mm.
in their skulls, or paralyzed or whatever, and him telling us when we bring our Jewish National Fund little tzedakah boxes home from Hebrew school, to plant, collect money, plant a tree in
Plant
Israel.
trees.
Right. And he
Yeah.
says, you mean uproot Palestinian olive groves? And I'm like, what's a Palestinian? So I was getting this from him. At the same time, he sent me and my two siblings to a Zionist summer camp. Now, it was a left-wing, kibbutz-oriented labor Zionist summer camp that was as progressive as you could get inside the Zionist framework, which meant that they would talk proudly about Arab-Jewish coexistence groups and land for peace, and they would tell us about the occupation. And some of the more progressive counselors there would uh, talk about human rights violations and torture and things like that. So we were aware that Israel had gone astray, but that already presumes that Israel itself, there's something salvageable about the notion of an ethno-state. And that camp was very fond of it. Now, why did my dad send us there? I don't know. It was the best game in town. The other alternatives were, wasn't really a secular, non-nationalistic, like Yiddishkeit alternative at the time, really. All my friends went there. His
Right.
brothers had both been camp directors there. I actually, it turns out, I always forget about this, but on my mom's side, my mom's uncle, my paternal grandfather's youngest brother, Ralph Moster, was an Air Force pilot in 1948 in the Haganah, and he died in the 1948 war. Somehow I always omit that, but I actually have that in my family history. For all I know, my great uncle bombed Arab villages.
Right.
So it's this complicated, and I need to learn more about this story. I'm sure it'd be actually fascinating to know. But the point is, I grew up exposed to the fact that there was another side, and finding it morally quite compelling, and finding the Jewish community increasingly disgusting as they tried to censor my father and call him a capo. And I mean, I'm telling you,
Yeah.
this word is not new to me,
Right.
and getting death threats or hate mail from Jews all over the country. And I just knew any group that behaves this way, that doesn't want to hear from one member of the group who's speaking out for the rights of another member, they must be wrong, just on strict whatever grounds. And I didn't know, I hadn't yet read Chomsky or Said or anything like that. I didn't know
Right.
the full history, but my spidey senses told me that any group that behaves this hysterically when their narrative is challenged must be hiding something, at least from themselves, if not from others. So that was the
Yeah.
complicated tension. But I still went back every summer, and I became a summer camp counselor and then a program director there.
Wow.
And in my final act as a program director, I tried to do, in fact, I did. We did a full special day basically about the Nakba, not in detail, but a day that fundamentally tried to challenge the notion that uncomplicatedly we got there.
Right.
We took an empty land, we made it better, and no harm, no foul. If it weren't for those meddling Arabs, we'd have peace, you know. And we really complicated it, and we presented the Palestinian side of things in a way that was upsetting enough to the Israeli counselors that they had a hard time going through with it, but they did. And it felt like it was my last act of trying to take this youth group to the very farthest edges of where it can go while still calling itself Zionist or post-Zionist or whatever. And after that, I aged out of it, and it was just as well because they haven't really moved too far. I mean,
No, they stay stuck.
they're still clinging.
Yeah. At the end of the day, they all still believe that a Jewish state should exist. That is the premise, regardless of what's happening with the Palestinians. And it's fascinating. Like I was not raised by people that were so educated and had access to information and had like I didn't have that. So it was very different. Like my grandparents were not so sharp. My parents didn't, they really had to just work to survive. Like it wasn't a matter of time to go exploring academia.
Yeah.
And so that's really, I think that's something that most people don't have. And that's the thing, like that's a very unique situation to come from that level of awareness at that age. And by the way, for people who don't know, what the era was about December of 87.
Yep.
Right? Yeah.
Starting then, yeah. Yeah, my dad's not an academic by any means. He's not a scholar, but he's very well read, and he's, in some ways, always been a public intellectual, but always been an activist too. But he was a family doctor back then. He was just,
Yeah.
But he was just a Jew who wouldn't shut up about what he thought the lesson of the Holocaust really was, which was never again for anyone. And he was a Holocaust survivor who wasn't going to let the mainstream Jewish community unopposed, just use the martyrdom of his grandparents and his and my grandparents' near extermination to be used to justify the dispossession of other people.
Yeah.
Speaking with Daniel Mate, from where I stand on the outside looking in, I can't even imagine what it's like. Obviously, where we are down here in South Florida, and the level of power that the Zionist community definitely holds, not just with Wasserman Schultz, but, a number of other blockades between Miami and West Palm Beach. And I'm just thinking, the more that this continues and the worse that it gets, and the more that it gets exposed, especially right now in lieu of the election being 7 weeks from tomorrow, I'm wondering if you think that they fully understand, the Zionists fully understand, that there has been this cross of a point of no return with this movement, that what they have done and what they have set in motion, it's not just the drastically underreported number of people that have been murdered, probably something close to the neighborhood of, probably 250,000 now when you consider everybody who's buried under rubble. It's, as Jenna's pointed out,
or who will die from the diseases that are already affecting
mass famine, disease, all things like that. The what will set in for multiple generations, the amount of jihad that will grow from this, from so many people. Is there? Do you think that there is this sort of understanding in the Zionist movement, even to have some inkling? Because I've been saying for a while, the Zionists are going to win a lot in the short term, but in the long term, they're going to lose everything. Do you think that there's enough people in that movement who are maybe starting to understand that circumstance? So you think that they're still completely oblivious to that reality?
There's different levels to that reality, and I think that reality doesn't hit people all at once, generally speaking, when they're that deeply entrenched in an ideological worldview. So I think they're probably keeping an eye on different fronts. The propaganda war is a big one that they're keeping an eye on. And I think they must, and I've spoken to, I don't write, I just walk around with my phone and talk to Instagram. But I've done videos about this where it can't be fun right now defending Israel. Because you can see that there's just been a sea change in the Jewish community itself, never mind the rest of the world, even among Jews. There are very few families, I would imagine, in America now, Jewish families, where there isn't some 1 or 2 degrees of separation from someone who's broken ranks. It's a large number of Jews want a ceasefire, a large number of American Jews, and Norman Finkelstein called this 15 years ago. He wrote a book called Knowing Too Much, the coming a breakup of American Jewry with Israel. You can't be liberal, which most American Jews fundamentally consider themselves to be, and support that state in the way it carries on, and it's the way it'll necessarily continue to carry on. So I think people are noticing that people's minds are changing, and they're probably also noticing that the door only swings one way. You're not going to get those people back. Once someone sees that, in fact, the state that you've been inculcated to support your entire life is, you don't want to call it apartheid, you don't want to call it genocide, just a bunch of fucking maniacs. Just really crazy and obnoxious and fascistic and militaristic and inhumane. Like, once you see what's happening to that society and you realize that the rot really is coming from the inside, there is really no going back.